Somewhere out in the desert, there is a field of dead airplanes so large you can see it from space. Thousands of aircraft, wingtip to wingtip, baking under a sun that never seems to set. For decades, people have called it the Nevada Boneyard. They've written about it, filmed it, whispered about it, alongside stories of Area 51 and black-budget test flights in the Nevada desert. There's just one problem. It was never in Nevada. And the real story of how this graveyard came to exist is stranger, older, and far more deliberate than the myth ever gave it credit for. Because this wasn't an accident. It wasn't some forgotten dumping ground where the Air Force simply ran out of places to put things. It was a calculated decision made in the final months of World War II, born out of a problem so massive that no one had ever faced it before. What do you do with tens of thousands of airplanes the moment a world war ends and you no longer need them? The answer to that question would create the largest aircraft storage facility on Earth, and it would happen not in Nevada, but in a patch of Arizona desert most Americans have never heard of. By the time you finish this video, you'll know why the ground itself was the reason this place exists. You'll understand how a single geological quirk turned an empty stretch of Arizona into a parking lot for the most powerful air force in human history. And you'll hear about the aircraft that vanished into that desert and were never seen again, the ones that were reborn as missiles, and the one job that still exists today, walking those endless rows, deciding which machines live and which are cut apart for scrap. This is the true story of the Boneyard, and almost everything you think you know about it is wrong. To understand why this graveyard had to exist, you need to understand just how enormous American aircraft production became during the war. In 1939, the United States built about 2,800 military aircraft in the entire year. By 1944, American factories were producing that many aircraft in a single week. Plants like Willow Run in Michigan, built by Ford, were rolling a completed B-24 Liberator off the line every 63 minutes at their peak. Boeing, Consolidated North American, Douglas, Lockheed, all of them running around the clock, 3 shifts a day, building bombers and fighters and transports faster than any nation had ever built machines of war. By the end of the war, American industry had produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft. Not tanks, not trucks, airplanes, massive 4-engine bombers like the B-17 and B-24, fast fighters like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt, transport planes, trainers, reconnaissance aircraft, flying boats. The Army Air Forces alone had over 70,000 aircraft in service by 1945, scattered across bases in England, the Pacific, North Africa, and every training field back home in the United States. Every one of those aircraft had cost the American taxpayer a fortune, and every one of them had been built for a single purpose: to fight and win a war that, in the summer of 1945, was finally ending. And that was the problem nobody in Washington had fully prepared for. What happens to an air force that size the moment the shooting stops? Germany surrendered in May of 1945. Japan surrendered in September. And almost overnight, the greatest industrial war machine in history had no war left to fight. Factories that had been building bombers around the clock received cancellation notices for contracts worth billions of dollars. Boeing's Seattle plant, which had been producing B-29 superfortresses at a staggering rate, saw its orders slashed within days of Japan's surrender. Convair, North American, Consolidated Vultee, all of them faced the same sudden silence. But the bigger problem wasn't the factories, it was the aircraft that already existed. Bases across the Pacific were packed with thousands of combat aircraft that had flown their last mission. In England, entire fields of B-17 sat idle, their crews already shipped home or waiting for transport back to the United States. The Army Air Forces found themselves the owners of tens of thousands of airplanes that were almost overnight obsolete, not because they didn't work, because there was no war left for them to fight in, and keeping a peacetime air force that size would have cost more than the country was willing to spend. Within months, the United States military was sitting on a surplus of aircraft, larger than the combined air forces of every other nation on Earth. Something had to be done with all of it, and it had to be done fast. Storing an airplane isn't like storing a rifle or a truck. Aircraft are enormous, delicate machines, full of aluminum skin that corrodes, hydraulic systems that seize up, rubber seals that dry out and crack, and engines that need constant attention or they seize solid. You can't just park a B-29 in a field and walk away from it. Or, as it turned out, you actually can, but only if you pick exactly the right field. That search for the right field is where the real story begins, and where the popular version of this story starts to fall apart, because the Air Force didn't scatter its surplus aircraft randomly across the American West. They needed somewhere with almost no rainfall, because rain means corrosion. They needed low humidity, because humidity destroys aluminum and rubber and instruments faster than almost anything else. And critically, they needed ground hard enough to support the weight of a 4-engine bomber without any pavement at all, because paving an area large enough to hold thousands of aircraft would have cost a fortune the government didn't want to spend twice. There is a specific kind of soil found in parts of the American Southwest called caliche, a natural hardpan formed by calcium carbonate that cements desert soil into something close to concrete. It happens to be extremely common around one particular Arizona city, Tucson, and just outside Tucson sat a fairly modest Army airfield that had been used during the war primarily as a training base for bomber crews. Its name was Davis-Monthan Field. Davis-Monthan had almost none of the fame of the big coastal bases or the legendary training fields of Texas and Oklahoma. It was a training command post, teaching young men how to fly bombers before shipping them off to war. But it had two things, almost nowhere else in the country combined: bone-dry air that averaged around 10 inches of rain a year, and a natural hardpan floor that could support the weight of the heaviest bombers in the American arsenal without a single foot of concrete. In 1946, the Air Force made its decision. The desert around Tucson, Arizona, not Nevada, would become the final resting place for America's surplus Air Force. The first aircraft rolled in that same year. 600 B-29 superfortresses, the very bombers that had ended the war in the Pacific, were flown in and parked in long, precise rows across the desert floor. Then came C-47 transports by the hundreds, then B-24s. Ground crews wrapped canopies and engine intakes in a spray-on plastic coating to seal them from dust and sun, a preservation technique that had never been used at this scale before. Fuel tanks were drained, batteries were pulled, and one by one, the bombers that had firebombed Tokyo and flattened German industry sat down in the Arizona sun and went silent. Word spread quickly among veterans and aviation enthusiasts about this strange new field of parked bombers outside Tucson. But somewhere along the way, in the retelling and the rumor and the decades of Cold War secrecy that would blanket the American Southwest, the story got scrambled. Nevada had Area 51. Nevada had the atomic testing grounds. Nevada had the mystique. And somewhere in the public imagination, the world's largest airplane graveyard got quietly relocated 400 miles west to a state that, as it happens, had nothing to do with it at all. The real graveyard was never hidden. It was sitting in plain sight outside a city of 500,000 people, and almost nobody outside Arizona even knew its real name. So what actually happened to all those airplanes once they landed in the desert? This is where the story gets far more interesting than the myth ever allowed for, because the aircraft at Davis-Monthan did not simply sit there and rot. They were sorted almost immediately into different fates, and the decision about which fate a given aircraft received was one of the most consequential and least discussed choices of the entire post-war period. Some aircraft were kept in what the Air Force called flyable storage, essentially mothballed but maintained well enough that they could theoretically be reactivated. Others were stripped for parts, their engines and instruments and landing gear pulled to keep the smaller remaining active fleet running. And a shocking number, particularly of the smaller and mid-sized bombers that the post-war Air Force simply had no future use for, were sold or scrapped outright. The scrapping operations that took place at Davis-Monthan and at sister facilities like Kingman, Arizona, and Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, remain some of the most staggering acts of industrial destruction in American history. Contractors were paid to melt aircraft down for their aluminum content, feeding a starving post-war scrap metal market. At Kingman alone, more than 5,000 aircraft, mostly B-17S and B-24S that had survived combat missions over Germany and the Pacific, were run through a massive smelter and reduced to ingots of raw aluminum within a few short years. Entire squadrons that had flown through flak over Berlin ended their existence as scrap metal sold by the pound. Bombers that had survived enemy fighters, flak barrages, and 1,000-mile missions over Nazi Germany were fed into a smelter and turned into ingots, sold by the pound, because nobody in 1947 wanted to pay to keep them. But not every aircraft at Davis-Monthan met that fate, and this is where the story takes its most unexpected turns. The B-29 Superfortress fleet parked there in 1946 didn't simply sit idle waiting for the torch. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the Air Force suddenly needed heavy bombers again, and fast. Ground crews walked those long silver rows at Davis-Monthan, pulled the plastic preservation coating off engines that had been sitting untouched for 4 years, and within weeks had dozens of B-29s flying combat missions again over Korea. The desert that everyone assumed was a graveyard turned out, in the right circumstances, to be something closer to a reserve army in waiting. Then there was the strangest chapter of all. As the Air Force entered the missile age in the 1950s and 1960s, they needed a steady supply of expendable aircraft for an entirely new purpose: target drones. Old fighters and bombers stored at Davis-Monthan were converted into remote-controlled targets, flown by radio control into the paths of experimental air-to-air missiles being tested over the southwestern desert. Aircraft that had once carried American aircrews into combat over Europe were now flying pilotless, straight into weapons designed to shoot them out of the sky, in tests that shaped the missile technology still used today. And some aircraft simply disappeared into private hands. Surplus dealers bought war-weary transports and bombers at auction for a fraction of their original cost, stripping them down and reselling them to cargo airlines, agricultural spraying operations, and even Hollywood studios hungry for authentic warplanes to film in post-war aviation pictures. A B-17 that had flown 25 missions over Germany might end its career hauling fertilizer across the Central Valley of California, its bomb bay repurposed to carry chemical tanks instead of ordnance. A bomber that survived Nazi flak over Berlin might have spent its final years spraying pesticide over a cotton field in California, and almost nobody who saw it fly overhead ever knew what it had once been. By the 1960s, the operation at Davis-Monthan had become something far more organized and permanent than anyone in 1946 could have imagined. It was formally designated the Military Aircraft Storage and Disposition Center, and later renamed the Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Center. Today it operates under the Air Force Materiel Command as the 309th Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group, still using that same bone-dry alkaline soil that made the entire operation possible in 1946. It still holds more retired military aircraft than anywhere else on the planet, at times more than 4,000 at once. Everything from Vietnam-era fighters to Cold War bombers to modern airframes waiting for their turn to be reactivated, scrapped, or sold. There are stories buried in that desert that most people have never heard. During the Cold War, entire squadrons of B-52 bombers were stored, and later deliberately cut apart with a specific guillotine blade in full view of Soviet satellites passing overhead, as a way of proving to Moscow under arms reduction treaties that the bombers had actually been destroyed and not simply hidden. You can still see the severed fuselage sections from space today, a visible, verifiable act of disarmament captured on camera for the entire world and for the enemy to see. Forgotten in the far corners of the facility were experimental aircraft, prototypes that never entered full production, quietly retired and left in storage rather than scrapped, some of them so obscure that aviation historians didn't rediscover their presence for decades. Vintage aircraft collectors and museums have, over the years, been permitted to pull specific rare airframes out of long-term storage for restoration, meaning that some of the very planes people assumed were destroyed in 1947 are flying again today at air shows, restored down to their original wartime paint schemes. And there is one detail that almost nobody outside Tucson knows. That dry, hard desert ground wasn't just useful for storing aircraft. It became so associated with military aviation that it eventually gave the city of Tucson one of the highest concentrations of aviation heritage sites in the country, more than most people realize exists anywhere in the American Southwest, let alone in a state that isn't Nevada. The myth put this graveyard 400 miles away in the wrong state, on the wrong sand, under the wrong history, and the truth turned out to be more remarkable than the legend ever was. The legacy of that decision made in 1946 still shapes military aviation today. Every major air force in the world now maintains some version of an aircraft boneyard, a dry, secure storage facility where retired airframes wait, sometimes for scrapping, sometimes for resurrection. The techniques developed at Davis-Monthan, the spray-on preservation coatings, the systematic parts harvesting, the careful balance between storage and disposal, became the blueprint the Air Force still uses to manage its aging fleets. Surviving veterans of that first 1946 storage operation, now long gone, could never have imagined that the field they filled with mothballed B-29s would still be operating and still growing 80 years later. Museums across the country owe some of their finest restored aircraft to that Arizona desert. Private collectors owe their prized warbirds to surplus auctions that once sold historic aircraft for pennies on the dollar. And the next time you see a photograph online claiming to show the world's largest airplane graveyard hidden away in the deserts of Nevada, you'll know the truth. The real graveyard has a name, a history, and an address. And none of them are in Nevada at all. So the next time somebody tells you about the secret Nevada boneyard, you'll know exactly where the real one is, what really happened to the aircraft inside it, and why the ground itself decided their fate. If you enjoyed uncovering this piece of history, make sure you're subscribed because there's another story just like this one coming, about a different kind of surplus, hiding in plain sight, waiting for its myth to be corrected.